Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Why Did the Renaissance Start in Italy by History Matters? An interesting question. And recently we did a reaction to Epic History's video on the rise and fall of Venice, so this seems like a particularly appropriate follow-up. Now, I won't get into it now, but my answer to that question is twofold. One, access. Two, money. That's why I think the Renaissance started in Italy. It's more complicated than that, but we'll get into it throughout this video. Now, before we do, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Italy is famous for being the birthplace of the Renaissance, a cultural movement which saw greater connection to the classics, changing views on man's place in the world, as well as changes in artistic techniques, which meant that no longer would the modern world be burdened by low-effort, two-dimensional, unexpressive, basic drawings which looked nothing like the people they were supposed to. Anyway, this movement would soon spread all across Europe, revolutionising the worlds of art and philosophy, but this does raise a question. Why did it begin in Italy? So to answer this, there are four potential reasons.
Okay, I had two. Right? I said money. They have the money to start this whole artistic and cultural movement, and access, largely meaning access to a lot of the classical sources, literature, architecture that would become revitalized during this era. But we've got four reasons, so let's see them.
Which are all fiercely debated. The first of these is that the Renaissance never actually happened.
Whoa.
The argument being that the period just saw a continuation of medieval art and philosophy with some slight changes in subject matter, and that for most people, life was no different. Reason number two is...
Yeah, I've heard this theory. It's sort of... I'm not an expert on this topic, right? So I feel like I'm diving into a debate that I really know nothing about. From the surface, it certainly seems like the Renaissance happened. Seems like there was a change in art, culture, literature, these types of things. But maybe if I read into the sort of academic debate, it'd make a little more sense to me, right? Perhaps it is more a continuation of a pre-existing trend. And of course, we have the Renaissance, supposedly starts in Italy, spreads across Europe. There were other cultural, artistic, literature movements around Europe at that time. So I think perhaps we put a little too much emphasis on the Renaissance as sort of this one starting point for a lot of modern trends, when in reality it is more complicated. But as far as I can tell, the Renaissance happened, but once again, I'm definitely not a scholar of the subject.
The fall of the Byzantine Empire. During the sad and drawn-out collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire, many Greek scholars fled the region, and they ended up in Italy, mostly Florence. With them, they brought many ancient Greek texts, as well as some Latin ones which had been lost to the rest of Europe. This increased interest in the classical world, which in turn led to an increased desire for art and philosophy that represented that world. The third reason often posited is that the conditions in Italy during the period were completely unique.
Right, so before we get to that, on the fall of the Byzantine Empire, I would definitely say that had something to do it. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. All right, fall of the Byzantines. Part of that is a lot of these Greek scholars, they leave, and a lot of them come over to Italy, bringing perhaps a renewed interest in some of these sources, and perhaps bringing some of these ancient sources and pieces of literature with them, even some of the knowledge surrounding those pieces. I would say there's another part to this, which is, and once again, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I do wonder if the fall of the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, perhaps revitalized interest in that ancient Roman history, right? Because that ancient empire had finally fallen, maybe that's a good time to be like, hey, maybe we should look back on everything that happened, right? I could imagine something like that as well. And then the other thing, and this might be what they're about to get to, this is a little more economic in nature, and it has to do not necessarily with the fall of the Byzantine Empire, but with the decline of the Byzantine Empire. But as the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, declined, a lot of these Italian city-states, including Venice, which we recently did a reaction to, Epic History's video on Venice, a lot of these Italian city-states, they picked up a lot of lucrative trade deals in the Eastern Mediterranean, right, taking a lot of the business that the Byzantines may once have monopolized, trading around that region. And so they were bringing in a lot of money. And with that money, they were able to more closely focus on culture and art and literature and intellectualism and all these types of things, right? So when I say money, I think those Mediterranean trade deals were bringing in a lot of the money that made the Renaissance possible. So that's sort of my take on it, but that might be what they're about to get into, talking about the unique situation of Italy during this period.
The third reason often posited is that the conditions in Italy during the period were completely unique. Unlike the rest of Europe, northern Italy had managed to establish a long-lasting peace. A previous war between Venice and Milan ended with everyone sort of agreeing to just be cool about it and stop trying to conquer the others. Furthermore, there was...
Well, we also saw that, a lot of this sort of eventually collapses as these Italian states start to form land empires. But previous to that, a lot of these Italian states, like Venice, the sort of empires they were forming were largely trade-based empires, right? You saw, if I can get back to that map we saw, right. So you can see, and this was some sort of later expansion, territorial expansion in northern Italy, but a lot of the territory that Venice holds, it's down the coast, Dalmatian coast in the Balkans, a lot of these sort of Greek islands, a lot of former Byzantine territory, right? So they weren't necessarily fighting Italian states in Italy itself. That is what would happen, but I'm talking about over this period leading up to the Renaissance. A lot of the conquering they're doing is in the service of that trade empire, right? Which sort of adds more to that wealth that they were bringing in and allows them to live in relative peace and wealth back in Italy itself until sort of the end of the Middle Ages, when some of these wars really start up in Italy itself.
Everyone sort of agreeing to just be cool about it and stop trying to conquer the others. Furthermore, there was a lot of trade between these northern Italian city-states and overseas.
Yep.
This led to the creation of wealthy merchant and banking families.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I was talking about. You bring in a lot of money from trade, wealthy merchant families, a lot of wealthy banking families as well. Right? You're loaning money out to a lot of these countries. Some of that money is invested into the economy, into industry, right? So the money brought in from trade, banking, also allows other industries to thrive, shipbuilding, for instance. And then a lot of that money, well, what do you invest into? Like I said, you invest into the arts, and you sort of build towards the Renaissance.
Who had a lot of money, which, when combined with the savings from not being at war, meant that other things could now be bought. This availability of patronage, combined with close cultural links and nobody wanting to murder you, led to the flourishing of arts and philosophy. And the fourth reason...
Right, and of course you look at the Renaissance, and a fair amount of Renaissance art was funded by a variety of governments throughout Italy, but a lot of it was done through patronage from wealthy families. Now, sometimes that was through a government, right? A lot of these city-states were run by essentially oligarchies, and so even if the funding came through the government, it was still coming from one of these wealthy families, like the Medicis, they're the most famous of the bunch, or through private patronage. Right? A lot of the most famous art of the Renaissance came through private patronage from wealthy banking merchant families who paid a lot of these emerging artists to do a sculpture or a painting or whatever.
Reason was the plague. As you'll know, the bubonic plague killed a lot of people, and northern Italy, particularly Florence, was hit pretty hard. The theory is that all those dead people meant that jobs couldn't be filled, which led to skilled, ambitious people travelling to the cities for better paid work.
Interesting. The Black Death, it is an extremely important event in this era of European history. For example, it really does sort of shake up social relations and economic relations throughout the continent. I haven't heard of this sort of example, but another example is that the Black Death, a lot of people die, a lot of peasants and serfs die. One thing that does is it gives the remaining peasants quite a lot of leverage over their landlords. Peasants are able to pick up and leave, right? So a lot of peasants are either able to leave, start their own farms, or negotiate with their landlords for better conditions. And so you actually see a bit of a shift away from some of the most oppressive conditions of serfdom to either, it sounds a little silly, but less oppressive serfdom, or for some peasants, sort of full freedom for them to run their own farms, or at least a different settlement with their local lord, right? So, the Black Death really does shake up conditions throughout Europe, and this is clearly another example of that.
This work was paid for by those who had come into sudden windfalls from their recently plague-hosting relatives. And it's also argued that the sudden loss of so many people so quickly led to a reassessment of life and its meaning, and thus the wealth...
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine that would be quite the existential challenge when you see around you, depending on where you live, like a third to a half of people dying, that would definitely make you reevaluate everything. I mean, when we have these massive plagues throughout history, oftentimes you'll see a rise of new ideologies, new ways of thinking, new art and literature that deals with the massive amount of death. So I could see the argument that this sort of monumental event might lead to some sort of humanism, which is what develops. Maybe a reevaluation of the human condition, of individualism, right? These types of things.
Delphi spent more money on art and architecture as a celebration of life and faith. Now, of course, it's impossible to know exactly what caused the Renaissance, but it's likely that
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these massive historical events that you're never really going to get one answer to, because one, it's probably a combination of things, and two, there are just going to be endless debates among historians and academics over why this actually happens. Maybe the topic that is most notorious for this is the rise and existence of capitalism, right? How did capitalism rise? Why? How did it sort of take over the global economy? There was just an immense academic debate over this topic, right? I mean, it's absolutely incredible, right? There's extreme depth to it. You really get down to the nitty-gritty. I don't even want to wade into the conversation, because there's so much debate, no one agrees with anyone else, right? So whenever you talk about these big historical topics, whether the Renaissance or the rise of capitalism or the sort of formation of the modern nation state, all of these types of things, there's just an immense amount of debate and disagreement.
a combination of the above factors was responsible, thereby ushering in a new phase of artistic expression and banishing low-quality two-dimensional drawings from public life thereafter. Thank you for watching, with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizanet, Sky Chappelle, Kartoitska, Marcus
Alright, and hey, thank you to my patrons. It's very appreciated, all the support. So yeah, that was another interesting video. Like I said, I felt it was a good follow-up to our reaction to Epic History's video on the rise and fall of Venice. Got to talk a little bit more about the Renaissance. I think I made some similar points in that one and this one. So yeah, I always enjoy History Matters videos, you know. You've got relatively short, digestible, but very interesting videos. They do a great job. So if you enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, right? I was just thanking all my patrons. Really appreciate all the support. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.